There is no fixed relationship between the number of people and the amount of space needed to house them. Whether or to what extent children will share rooms or have their own individual rooms, the time at which young adults will move out to form their own households, and the extent to which single kinfolks or roomers live with families are all variable according to the price of housing and the incomes of the people making the decisions. Virtually every American ethnic group, for example, has at some point or other gone through a stage at which taking in roomers was a pervasive social phenomenon. Artificially low prices under rent control facilitates the disaggregation of existing families or living units into smaller groups of individuals with separate households, and facilitates the use of more space per person in existing households, so that very quickly no vacancy signs appear almost everywhere. After that point, people who find themselves having to move for compelling reasons may have to double up or live in garages or other makeshift overcrowded housing precisely because of the general use of more space per person in the country as a whole. While young couples with growing families may find themselves increasingly overcrowded in housing that was once adequate, older couples whose children have left home have little financial incentive to give up larger housing units that the family once needed, because rent control makes the larger unit affordable and leaves few alternative places to move into. In the absence of rent control, there is an incentive for a continuous interchange of different-sized housing units among families at different stages of their life cycle. The growing young family trades off other things for housing incrementally, while the older family with children leaving the nest can trade off excess space for other things they want. Prices convey effective knowledge of these ever-changing trade-offs, directing each set of decision-makers to where they can get the most satisfaction from their own respective viewpoints from their respective assets. Rent control distorts or virtually eliminates this flow of information. The same set of people and the same set of physical assets continue to exist, but the simple fact that they cannot redistribute themselves among the assets in accordance with their divergent and changing desires means that there is less satisfaction derived from a given housing stock. Though it is the same physical matter, its value is less. The losses resulting from rent control are not losses of physical matter or of money. Both can exist in the same amounts as before, and therefore cannot be measured in objective statistical data based on the relevant transactions, renting. The reduction or non-existence of desired transactions is precisely the loss, and no numbers or expertise can objectively measure thwarted desires. The most that can be objectively documented are waiting lists, illegal payments to landlords, and other scattered artifacts analogous to the broken pottery and remnants of clothing available to anthropologists studying prehistoric peoples. In a longer time perspective, rent control prices convey distorted knowledge not only about the optimal allocation of existing housing, but about the trade-offs people would be willing to make to get new housing. Renters are forbidden to convey the full urgency of their desire for new housing in the form of financial incentives that would reach landlords, financial institutions, and builders. This urgency may be growing as the old housing continually deteriorates and wears out, but the effective signal received by builders may be that there are few resources available to be traded off for more housing. The effective signals received by landlords with old buildings may be that there is little available to be traded off to get the maintenance and repair needed to keep them going, even though the tenants might prefer paying more rent to seeing the building deteriorate or the landlord abandon it entirely, as has happened on a mass scale in New York City, where rent control has persisted long after World War II. Rent control illustrates not only the ease with which political systems can distort the transmission of knowledge in an economic system. Its history also illustrates how difficult it is for effective feedback to correct a political decision. Political decision-making units are defined by geographic boundaries, not by particular subsets of people who experience the consequences of given policies. Rent control laws passed decades ago to benefit New Yorkers, or tenants in New York, were initially judged through the political process by incumbent New Yorkers and incumbent tenants on the basis of the prospective plausibility of such laws. A generation later, deaths, births, and normal migration in and out of the city mean that the electorate has turned over considerably, and very few of them have personally experienced the effects of rent control from start to finish. Many of those who actually experienced the deterioration of housing under rent control in New York City are now living outside New York City, some as a direct result. Their experience does not feed back through the electoral process in the city. The current New York City electorate includes great numbers of people who arrived in the city by birth or migration when it was already experiencing the effects of rent control, so they have no before and after experience to compare. They do not know, for example, that the city once had a larger population, no housing shortage, and no masses of abandoned buildings. Their personal experience does not go back far enough to enable them to spot the fatal flaw in the argument that rent control cannot be safely repealed while there is still a housing shortage. Lacking this personal experience, they would have to be trained in economics to realize that a shortage is itself a price phenomenon, and so will persist as long as the rent control persists. While time and complexity insulate many political decisions from effective feedback from the general electorate, some offsetting knowledge is furnished by groups with lower knowledge costs because they are more obviously affected adversely. The real estate lobby and landlord associations in this case. In general, special interests have not only lower costs of knowledge of their own interests, but an incentive to invest in discovering how other groups' interests are similarly affected, so as to acquire political allies. However, to the extent that special interest arguments are automatically discounted, this knowledge is ineffective or even counterproductive. Landlord and real estate interests, for example, provide pro-rent control forces with an enemy to fight, a sense of moral superiority in fighting, and a reassurance that they are acting in the interests of others who need protecting, though this last crucial point rests on an implicit conception of the economy as a zero-sum or negative-sum game. Once the economy is seen as a positive-sum game, that voluntary transactions are mutually beneficial or they would not occur, then the losses suffered when such transactions are forcibly restricted can also be mutual. The fact that the complaints issue first or exclusively from one party may reflect only his lower costs of knowledge of the effects on him. More generally, to totally discount all special interest arguments is to implicitly assume that society is inherently a zero-sum game, which is difficult to reconcile with the fact that societies of some sort or other have existed among all peoples and ages. The effects of rent control on the quality of housing illustrates a more general characteristic of price control and of the limits of articulation. Whatever price is forcibly set by an observer, he must define the product whose price is being controlled, and his articulation can seldom match the unarticulated experience of actual voluntary transactors. The result is that prices set below the level that would have prevailed otherwise lead to quality deterioration. In the case of rent-controlled apartments, maintenance, repair, painting, cleaning, heat, hot water, and general monitoring all decline. This is less damaging to brand new buildings than to older buildings, which require more upkeep to avoid becoming slums. Since low-income people are more likely to live in older buildings, they are more likely to find their homes become unheated slums with uncorrected building hazards. In the extreme, they may find the building totally abandoned by the landlord, once the cost of maintaining it at minimum legal levels exceeds the rent permitted. In New York City, such abandonments average about 25,000 units per year. Rent control is not unique in affecting the quality of the product. General price controls during World War II brought on a proliferation of inferior off-brands, some made by brand-name producers who did not want to damage the long-run reputation of their regular label. Sometimes the quality deterioration took the form of deteriorated service, leading to much contemporary comedy based on arrogant butchers, insolent salespeople, etc. In general, price control involves articulating not only a price, which is easy, but also articulating the characteristics of a product. Although it may seem easy to define a product, such as an apartment, actual experience demonstrates the crudity of articulation as compared to unarticulated experience. An apartment is not simply a physical thing, but involves a multitude of associated services, changes in the quantity and quality of which affect operating cost, the vacancy rate, and the price that can be charged in an uncontrolled market. When rents are forcibly lowered by the government, costs are voluntarily lowered by the landlords through declines in the quantity and quality of service, so that the product itself changes. A perfect legal specification of a product, perfectly monitored, would make this impossible. But the pervasiveness of this deterioration, including total abandonment, indicates the limits of articulation and third-party monitoring. In the absence of rent control, tenants monitor changes themselves and communicate their reactions to the landlord not only verbally, but, more convincingly, through changes in the vacancy rate. They can even monitor services of which they are generally unaware, in the sense that they might not list them if asked to articulate what they want in an apartment building. For example, many tenants might not articulate a concern for management's monitoring of people who enter the building. And yet, if the building becomes a hangout for loiterers, hoodlums, or addicts, the vacancy rate would rise. Conversely, if the management officiously screened all entering guests, the same negative reaction would occur. In other words, a service which is seldom articulated must not only be performed, but performed within limits on either side, if the landlord is to minimize his vacancy rate and maximize his rental income. The multiplicity and importance of these auxiliary services is most dramatically seen not in uncontrolled markets, where they become routine, but by their absence in rent control buildings and in government housing projects.